The smell hit him first. Antiseptic and old coffee and something underneath both, the particular staleness of a building that had absorbed too many years of waiting. Marcus Thibodeau knew that smell. He had known it since the first time they brought him here 19 years old, shrapnel still in his left shoulder, the jungle still in his eyes. That was 43 years ago. He was 62 now, and he walked the same hallway with the same deliberate stride his cane, tapping the linoleum in a rhythm that the nurses on the third floor had learned to recognize before they could see him. He was a large man, not tall, but built from something dense and unyielding mahogany and iron. The kind of frame that age had not diminished so much as compressed into something more concentrated. His hair was silver now, cropped close. His face carried the lines of a man who had seen things that did not translate into polite conversation. His dark eyes moved constantly, cataloging exits and angles and the positions of everyone in the room, a habit so old he no longer noticed doing it. He had been born in Beaumont, Texas, the fourth of 7 children of a man who worked the refineries and a woman who taught elementary school. He had grown up in a house that was small and loud and organized around 2 principles. You do the work correctly, and you do not ask for credit for doing the work correctly, because doing it correctly is its own purpose. His father had said this so many times that Marcus had stopped hearing it as a saying, and started hearing it as a frequency, something the house itself emitted. He had enlisted at 18. He had not been drafted. He had enlisted, which his mother had not understood, and his father had understood completely. And neither of them had said anything about the distinction because the distinction did not change where he was going. Vietnam in 1969 was not one thing. It was 100 different things happening in the same geography with the same casualties. Marcus Thibodeau of Beaumont, Texas, arrived at Phu Bai in February and was assigned to a platoon that had been operating in the field for 7 months. He learned the names of the men in his platoon, the way you learn anything under pressure completely and permanently, with the specific clarity that comes from knowing a mistake in recall could cost someone their life. He had kept those names for 43 years. He could recite them in his sleep. He sometimes did. The shrapnel had come on a morning in April outside a village whose name he had never been able to render in English exactly as it sounded. A misfire. Not combat exactly, one of the 10,000 things that happened in that landscape that did not fit cleanly into any category. Roy Eskins had pulled him out of the ditch. The medic had stabilized him. They had airlifted him to a field hospital where a surgeon had looked at the fragment in his shoulder and made the calculation that removing it carried more risk than leaving it. He had come home in August. He had spent 3 months recovering. He had applied to the Beaumont Police Department in November, been accepted in January, and started work in February, almost exactly 1 year after he had arrived in Vietnam. He had spent 22 years as a police officer. He had made detective in his 6th year. He had retired as a sergeant in charge of the homicide division, which at the time of his retirement had the 2nd highest case clearance rate in the state. He did not consider this a personal achievement so much as the natural consequence of doing the work correctly for 22 years. He came to the Westfield Veterans Affairs Medical Center on the 2nd Thursday of every month. He had been coming for 11 years since the shrapnel that had stayed behind in his left shoulder, a fragment the size of a fingernail that the Army surgeons had decided was safer to leave than to remove, had begun to shift. The VA clinic at Westfield was 40 minutes from his house in Beaumont. He drove himself. He had driven himself every 2nd Thursday for 11 years, parked in the same spot on the 2nd level of the garage, walked the same route through the main entrance, signed in at the same desk. The desk was staffed by a woman named Patricia, who had been there for 9 of those 11 years, and who always said the same thing when Marcus came through the door. She said, "Mr. Thibodeau," right on time. He said, "Yes, ma'am." It was a ritual. Small, consistent, real. The kind of thing that builds a life. Behind the check-in desk, the waiting area was half full. Plastic chairs in rows, a television mounted too high on the wall, cycling through a local news channel with the sound off a coffee machine in the corner that produced something that approximated coffee if you did not look too closely at the cup. Men and women of various ages, most of them carrying the particular stillness of people who have spent time in environments where stillness was not optional. Veterans recognize each other without introduction. It is a specific posture, a specific quality of attention. Marcus took his usual seat, third chair from the left in the second row. Good sightline to both the entrance and the corridor leading to the examination rooms. He set his cane against his knee. He opened the paperback he had brought. He read 3 pages without absorbing a word, which was what he always did in waiting rooms, because the real purpose of the book was not reading. The real purpose was having something to look at that was not the room. He came every second Thursday, not because the appointments were always medically necessary, but because the discipline of coming was itself part of the management. The shrapnel had shifted enough by his 51st year to produce a referred pain in his left arm that had taken 2 years and 4 physicians to correctly identify as coming from the shoulder rather than the heart. That diagnosis had been given to him in this building by a VA physician named Dr. Eleanor Washington, who had been the 3rd person to look at his imaging and the first to understand what she was looking at. He had been coming to see Dr. Washington or her colleagues ever since. He trusted the building because the building had given him back the correct answer, when 2 other buildings had given him wrong ones. He thought about that as he read his 3 pages without absorbing them. He thought about the specific texture of trust, how it accumulates and how it erodes, how the accumulation is slow and the erosion can be fast, how a building earns it over 11 years and a single morning can put pressure on it that it takes time to correct. He did not want to be angry. He had made that decision a long time ago, not as a suppression of the feeling, but as a management of the resource. Anger was real. Anger was a legitimate response to a world that produced legitimate causes for it. But anger spent carelessly was a resource depleted, and he had learned in the field in the department in 43 years of navigating institutions that were not built for him, that the resource was more valuable deployed precisely than spent generously. You find the pressure point. You apply force to it. You do not waste the force. He had been waiting 19 minutes when Officer Dale Pruitt walked in. Pruitt was assigned to a contracted security detail that covered 3 VA facilities in the county. He was 34 years old and had been doing this work for 6 years, long enough to develop a settled arrogance about the space. He was thick in the neck and florid in the face, with the kind of build that spoke less to fitness than to bulk maintained by habit rather than intention. He wore his uniform with the particular pride of a man who found meaning in the costume rather than the purpose behind it. He had come up through a private security company that held the county's VA contract. Before that, he had applied to 2 municipal police departments and been rejected by both the first time for a psych evaluation score that had come back borderline the second time without any explanation offered. He had never been told why, and had spent the years since constructing his own explanation, which involved the department's unwillingness to hire men of a certain directness and initiative. This narrative had become central to how he understood himself. He had 3 complaints on his VA record in 6 years. All 3 involved confrontations with patients in waiting areas. All 3 had been resolved with no formal discipline. The pattern that those 3 complaints formed, read together, was a pattern that the facility's record system had the capacity to identify, but that no one had yet assigned someone to look for. Marcus noticed him when he came through the door. He noticed everyone who came through the door. He had noticed Pruitt on previous visits, had cataloged him the way he cataloged everything, assigned him a position in the mental map of the building. Pruitt was the kind of security officer who walked the perimeter not to assess threats, but to be seen walking the perimeter. Marcus had known men like that since 1969. They were the most dangerous kind, not because they were capable, but because they needed to prove they were. He thought, here it comes. He had thought that thought before in various forms and various settings over the course of 62 years. He had thought it in the Army. He had thought it in the police department, sitting across a conference table from a supervisor who was about to tell him something that was not accurate. He had thought it in grocery stores and courtrooms and parking lots. The thought had a specific texture, not dread, not anger, but a kind of readiness, the body and mind coming to a particular arrangement with each other that said, "You have been here before. You know what this is. You know what to do. What you do is stay completely still. You do not give them your agitation. Your agitation is yours. They have no claim to it." Pruitt's eyes moved across the waiting room and stopped on Marcus. Marcus did not look up from his book. He felt the stop. In 30 years of working law enforcement, first as a military police investigator in the Army, then as a detective with the Beaumont Police Department, retiring as a sergeant after 22 years, he had developed the peripheral awareness that does not require eye contact to function. You feel a fixed gaze the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. The body registers it before the mind names it. He kept reading. Pruitt crossed the room. He stopped beside Marcus's chair. He said, "Sir, I need to see your identification." Marcus turned a page. He finished the paragraph he was on, or pretended to, because he had not actually absorbed any of it. Then he looked up. He said, "My identification is on file with the front desk. I checked in 19 minutes ago." His voice was what it always was, low-measured, carrying the particular resonance of a man who had given orders in circumstances where the wrong tone could cost lives. It did not rise. It did not sharpen. It simply occupied the space between them with complete authority. Pruitt's jaw tightened. He said, "I'm going to need to see it again, sir." The pause before "sir" was the tell. Marcus had heard that pause 10,000 times. It was the pause of a man using a word of respect to communicate its opposite. Marcus said, "I am a scheduled patient at this facility. I have a standing appointment every second Thursday. My records are in this system. My name is Marcus Thibodeau." Pruitt said, "I understand that. I still need to see ID." Marcus studied him for a moment. He set his book on his knee spine up to hold his page. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his VA identification card, his veteran's ID, and his driver's license. He held all three out in a single motion, the way a man holds out documentation he has produced many times before and has long since stopped finding remarkable. Pruitt took them. He looked at them longer than looking required. A woman in the row of chairs across the room watched. An older man, 2 seats down from Marcus, watched. Patricia at the front desk watched her expression carefully, neutral, her hands still on her keyboard. Pruitt handed back the ID cards. He said, "What are you here for today?" The silence that followed was 1 second long. Marcus said, "I am a patient at this facility with a scheduled medical appointment. The nature of that appointment is between me and my physician." Pruitt said, "I'm asking for your cooperation. We've had reports of individuals using the waiting room who are not authorized patients." Marcus said, "My authorization is on file with the front desk. I checked in 19 minutes ago. Patricia confirmed my appointment." Patricia across the room said quietly, "That's correct. Mr. Thibodeau is scheduled." Pruitt did not look at Patricia. He said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside with me while I verify your status." The room had gone quiet. The television cycled silently through its news loop. The coffee machine clicked and hummed in the corner. No one moved. Marcus said, "I am not going to step outside. I am a patient. I am in the designated waiting area. My appointment is in approximately 40 minutes. I have provided my identification. I have been confirmed by the front desk staff. I am going to wait here for my appointment." He said it the way he had once briefed intelligence reports, precise, sequential, absent of emotion. Every sentence a complete fact. No sentence doing more than it needed to do. Pruitt leaned forward slightly. He said, "You don't want to make this difficult." Marcus looked at him. He said, "I have not made anything difficult. You have asked for documentation I was not required to provide, and I provided it. You have asked me to relocate from a legitimate waiting area, and I have declined. I am asking you to identify the specific regulatory basis for your request." The color that moved into Pruitt's face was not the flush of anger. It was the flush of a man who has reached the end of the script he prepared and does not know what comes after it. He said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." And the room, which had been breathing carefully around the edges of this exchange, went very still. Marcus said, "On what basis?" Pruitt said, "Disruptive behavior." Marcus said, I need you to specify what behavior you are characterizing as disruptive, at what time it occurred, and how it meets the definition of disruptive behavior under this facility's patient conduct policy. I am asking you this because I intend to file a formal complaint, and the complaint will require that information. Pruitt's jaw worked. He said, you need to leave. Marcus said, I have not raised my voice. I have not made physical contact with any person in this facility. I have not interfered with any staff member or patient. I have not used threatening language. I have not moved from this chair except to stand when you approached. I have answered every question you asked. I have provided documentation you were not entitled to require. I am asking you, what behavior specifically are you designating as disruptive? The silence that followed was 8 seconds long. A sound came from somewhere in the waiting room. Not a word. Just a sound, the involuntary exhale of someone witnessing something that requires a response and is not yet sure what the response should be. Marcus looked at Pruitt for a long moment. He said, I have not raised my voice. I have not used threatening language. I have not interfered with any other patient or staff member. I have not moved from this chair. I have answered every question you have asked. You are asking me to leave a federal medical facility where I have a scheduled appointment on the basis of behavior that has not occurred. He picked up his book. He said, I am not leaving. The woman across the room, Darlene Reeves, had her phone out now. She was holding it at an angle that was not accidental, the specific angle of someone who has decided to record and is trying to do so without making the decision itself into a confrontation. She had seen 3 things in the last 4 minutes that she understood very clearly. She had seen a man with a cane and a VAID produce his documentation without being required to. She had seen a security officer's face do things that security officers' faces should not do. She had seen a waiting room full of people watching with the particular stillness of people who know something is wrong and are not sure yet what they owe it. She knew what she owed it. She tilted her phone. Pruitt put his hand on Marcus's arm. It was not a grab. It was a placement, a hand on a forearm, the beginning of a physical removal that had not yet committed to itself. But it was a hand on his arm. Marcus looked at the hand. He did not move. His eyes moved from the hand to Pruitt's face, and what Pruitt saw there, or what he did not quite see, which was any trace of fear, made him hesitate. Marcus said, remove your hand. His voice had dropped. Not in anger, in register. It had gone down an octave into a frequency that carried a different kind of weight. Pruitt removed his hand. He said, you need to leave, now. Marcus said, I need to speak with your supervisor and the facility administrator before I do anything else. Pruitt said, you're being removed from this facility for non-compliance. He reached for his radio. The call he made went to 2 other contracted security officers stationed elsewhere in the building. He described, and the people in the waiting room heard every word, a disruptive individual in the main waiting area who had refused to comply with a lawful order to vacate the premises. A woman across the room stood up. Her name was Darlene Reeves. She was 58, a Navy veteran, a retired postal supervisor, and she had been coming to this facility for 4 years. She had watched the entire exchange from her chair 3 rows back. She had her phone in her hand. She said, I'm recording this. Pruitt looked at her. She said, I have been recording since you walked over here. I want you to know that. Pruitt said, put that away. She said, I am in a public waiting area of a federal facility. I have every right to record. And I am going to. 2 more security officers arrived. They were younger than Pruitt, one barely past his mid-20s, the other in his early 30s, and they had the look of men who had arrived at a situation they had not assessed, and were now committed to a position they had not chosen. Marcus stood. He was not tall, but standing, he occupied space differently than most people. He stood with the stillness of someone who has stood in worse positions than this and knows exactly where his feet are. He said, I will walk out of this building under protest. I am noting that I have a scheduled medical appointment that I am being unlawfully prevented from keeping. I am noting the names of the personnel involved. I will be filing a formal complaint with the Veterans Affairs Inspector General before the close of business today. He reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a small notebook, the kind with a black cover that he had carried for 40 years. He wrote 3 things in it: Pruitt's badge number, the time, and the names of the 2 officers who had arrived. He closed the notebook. He picked up his cane. He walked toward the exit. The waiting room watched him go. At the door, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said, to no one in particular, and to everyone in particular, 43 years ago, I left part of my shoulder in a rice paddy outside Hugh. I came home. I built a career. I raised a family. I have been coming to this building for 11 years to manage what that tour left behind in my body. I have never once been anything other than a patient in a waiting room. He pushed through the door and went out into the morning. The morning was clear and mild, the kind of April day in Texas that has not yet committed to the heat that is coming. The parking garage light was flat and fluorescent at the entrance, giving way to natural light as he moved upward toward his level. The sound of traffic from the street beyond the facility grounds. The distant voice of a radio from somewhere in the garage above him. He walked to his truck with the same stride he had used to walk out of the building. He did not change the stride. He did not walk faster or slower than he had before any of this. He had decided a long time ago, in circumstances considerably more dangerous than this, that how you move when you have been diminished is a form of testimony. If you walk fast, you are fleeing. If you slow down, you are absorbing the blow. If you walk exactly the way you intended to walk before any of this happened, you are demonstrating something that does not require words. He had walked out of rooms. He had walked into rooms. He had walked in and out of enough of both that he knew the walk was the first draft of the account you gave to yourself about what had just happened. He walked to his truck. He opened the door. He got in. Behind him in the waiting area, Darlene Reeves was still recording. Her phone was pointed at the 3 security officers who stood in the space Marcus Thibodeau had just left. She did not put it down. She did not stop recording for another 4 minutes. The security camera mounted above the check-in desk had also been recording, as it always was. That footage was the property of the facility. It was stored on the facility's server. It would be reviewed eventually by people whose job it was to review it when things went wrong. She did not know yet what that recording was going to do, but she had a feeling. The facility's own camera had recorded the same 9 minutes from a different angle. When Carol Ingram pulled both recordings that afternoon, sitting at her desk with the door closed and a cup of coffee gone cold beside her keyboard, she watched them twice each. She sat for a moment after the second viewing. Then she began to write. Outside in the parking garage, Marcus sat in his truck for 7 minutes before he started the engine. He had done what he had learned to do in Vietnam and in 22 years of law enforcement when something happened that could not be addressed in the moment he had absorbed it. Cataloged it and filed it in the part of his mind that held things to be dealt with properly and in sequence. He was not shaking. He was not angry in any way that required management. He was something else. Something without a clean name. A combination of clarity and heaviness that he recognized as the feeling of having been diminished in a specific way, and having refused to accept the diminishment and knowing that the refusal, while correct, had cost something. He thought about all the men in that waiting room. Not just the veterans who had watched, all of them. He thought about what they had seen a man with a cane and 43 years of service being told he was not where he was supposed to be. He thought about what that image deposited in each of them, what it confirmed or denied about the world they lived in. He thought about the young staff member who had stopped in the corridor with the supply cart, the physician in the white coat, Patricia at the front desk. He thought about his notebook where Pruitt's badge number was written in the careful handwriting that 22 years of filing case reports had produced. He thought about the specific language of the Inspector General's complaint form, which he had filled out twice before on behalf of other officers during his career, and which he knew could be completed with sufficient precision to make it very difficult to dismiss. He opened his notebook. He wrote 4 more things while the details were fresh, the temperature of the room, the position of each witness, the exact sequence of Pruitt's physical contact with his arm, the time at which each event had occurred. Good documentation starts at the scene. He had said that to younger detectives more times than he could count. He had believed it then, and he believed it now. He thought about his platoon. He had not thought about them collectively in some time. Not since the reunion 4 years ago in Jackson, Mississippi, which he had attended and left early because the hotel bar had too many men trying to find the words for things that did not have words. He thought about Corporal Roy Eskins, who had pulled him out of the ditch outside Hugh on the same day he caught the shrapnel. He thought about Lieutenant Gerald Okafor, who had been the steadiest human being Marcus had ever known in any context under any circumstances. He thought about the rest of them. The 23 men who had moved through the same ground, breathed the same air, carried the same weight. He thought about what it meant to have survived, and to be sitting in a parking garage being told he was not authorized to be in the building where they treated the consequences of the surviving. He called his son Damien. He gave him the account the way he gave all accounts in sequence without editorializing with the specific details that allowed another person to understand exactly what had happened. Damien said, "I'm calling the Inspector General." Marcus said, "I already have the number. I'll file when I get home." Damien said, "Pop, you know who's going to be there today, right?" Marcus said, "What do you mean?" Damien said, "The platoon. The Beaumont chapter is having their quarterly meeting. They're holding it at the VFW post, but they moved the start time. 3 of them have appointments at Westfield this morning." Marcus sat with that for a moment. He said, "Who?" Damien named 3 names. Marcus knew all 3 faces, immediately could see them as they had been at 20, and as he had seen them at the reunion, and as they were now. Men his age built the same way time had built him, carrying the same invisible things. He said, "They have appointments this morning." Damien said, 9 o'clock. They're probably already there." Marcus looked at his watch. It was 8:47. He got out of his truck. He walked back toward the entrance. He was not walking fast. He was walking with the specific deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is executing the decision calmly and in sequence. He had called his wife first from the truck before he called Damien. Her name was Beverly, and she had been his wife for 34 years, and she had been a high school English teacher for 26 of them. And she had the particular intelligence of a woman who has spent decades reading people and situations with the care and precision that produces real understanding rather than surface impression. She listened to the account without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Are you hurt?" He said, "No." She said, "Are you angry?" He said, "Not in a way I can't manage." She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "File the complaint, get the documentation in order, follow up until it's been handled." She said, and then... He said, "Go back next month." She said, "Good, that's the right answer." He said, "I know." She said, "Marcus, I want you to know something. In 34 years, I have never once seen you do a thing you didn't believe in. That is extremely rare. I want you to know that I know it, and I am grateful for it, and I am very glad you did not give that man anything to work with this morning." He sat with that for a moment. He said, "I had better company in 1969 than he had this morning." She said, "Bring that notebook home." He said yes. He thought about Gerald Okafor's appointments this morning. He thought about what Okafor would see when he walked into the lobby, the same lobby Marcus had just been removed from. He thought about what Roy Eskins would see. He thought about what James Beaumont, with 30 years of reading institutional environments, would see in about 6 minutes. He thought they are going to understand exactly what happened. They are going to understand it in a way that does not require explanation. He thought, and they are going to be very still about it. He thought about the last time the 4 of them had been in the same place at the same time before the reunion, before any of the years between. He thought about the morning they had moved through the same stretch of ground together, a morning where the decisions of each had affected the survival of the others, where the bond between them had been formed not by choice, but by the specific alchemy of shared circumstance under pressure. He had not chosen these men. He had been assigned to them. And in the way of things forged under that kind of pressure, they had become something he had not needed to choose. They were simply present the way his left arm was present, the way the shrapnel was present. He thought they are going to walk in and they are going to know, and they are going to handle it the way they handle everything. He thought, "I am glad I called Damien. I am glad Damien knew they would be here. I am glad I got out of the truck." He had known these men for 43 years. He had been in the ditch with them. He had been in field hospitals with them. He had attended their father's funerals and their children's graduations and the reunion 4 years ago where they had sat in a hotel bar and been unable to find the right words and eventually gone home still carrying the thing. He knew their stillness. He knew what it looked like and what it meant. It meant we see what is happening. We know what it is. We know what to do about it. We are going to do it correctly. Inside the main entrance at the security checkpoint, Pruitt was still at his station. He saw Marcus come through the door, and his expression did what expressions do when they encounter something they had expected to be finished. Marcus said, "I am re-entering this facility as I have every right to do as a patient with a scheduled appointment. I am requesting to speak with the facility administrator. I am also informing you that there are additional veteran patients arriving for 9 o'clock appointments who are members of my unit. You may wish to reconsider your current approach to how you manage this waiting area." Pruitt said, "I told you to leave." Marcus said, "You told me to leave and I left, and now I have returned and I am telling you that I am a patient with a right to be here. My appointment has not been canceled. My records are in your system. I have not been lawfully barred from this facility." He walked past Pruitt. Pruitt reached for his radio again. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not what Pruitt had anticipated. At 8:52, 3 men walked through the main entrance of the Westfield Veterans Affairs Medical Center. They were respectively 61, 63, and 64 years old. They wore the particular bearing of men who had spent their formative years in conditions that required bearing to survive. They walked without urgency and without hesitation. 3 men who had been moving together through difficult terrain for 43 years, who had reconvened without drama, the way people reconvene when the bond is old enough. Roy Eskins had been a police chief in Lafayette for 16 years before retiring. He had started as a patrol officer the same year Marcus made detective, and they had stayed in contact through annual calls and the specific loyalty of men who had owed each other something real. Eskins was the kind of police chief a city remembers after he leaves. Not for any single thing he did, but for the accumulation of decisions made correctly over 16 years. Decisions that did not produce headlines, but produced a department that worked. He had a particular way of looking at situations involving the misuse of authority that came from having spent 16 years correcting it from the inside. Gerald Okafor had retired as a colonel from the United States Army. He was the steadiest man Marcus had ever known, steadier in the field, steadier in a meeting, steadier in the specific chaos of the kind of morning they had shared in 1969 than anyone had a right to be. He had gone back in after Vietnam, made a career of it, commanded with the same quietness that had always been his mode. The quietness that does not require volume because it carries authority that volume cannot replicate. He had been the kind of officer who his soldiers thought about when things were hard, not because he had told them to think about him, but because the way he had done things had lodged in their memories as a standard. The third man, James Beaumont, no relation to the city, had spent 30 years as a federal public defender. He had seen more institutional injustice than any of them in the specific clinical setting of courtrooms and case files, and he had developed the composure of a man who has processed a great deal of what is wrong with the world without either accepting it or being destroyed by it. He had won cases that should not have been winnable. He had documented patterns of abuse that had eventually found their way into policy revisions. He had the kind of knowledge that made him genuinely dangerous to anyone who tried to misuse an institution because he understood the institution's own language and could use it with complete precision. They came in and they saw Marcus. They saw Pruitt beside Marcus. They saw the situation the way men who have spent their lives reading situations see situations immediately, completely, without requiring explanation. Eskins' eyes went to Pruitt's badge number first, then to the 2 younger officers flanking him, then to Marcus's face, the specific face of a man who has absorbed something and has not yet had the opportunity to address it. Eskins had seen that face in Vietnam. He had seen it in the mirror in Lafayette for 16 years. He knew it the way he knew the weight of a file that had been handled wrong. Okafor said nothing. He stood and looked at Marcus the way he had looked at Marcus in 1969, in a field hospital, with the same complete and undramatic attention of a man whose concern does not require performance to be real. Beaumont was already looking at Pruitt's badge number. He was already making calculations. He had spent 30 years in courtrooms calculating the specific weight of what he was observing, the number of witnesses, the institutional setting, the documented history that any incident of this kind was going to require to address properly. He had already identified the legal framework before Eskins said a word. "Eskins," said Marcus. "Okafor," said Marcus. It was one word. It carried everything. Marcus said, "Gentlemen." Pruitt looked at the three men. He said, "I'm going to need to see ID from all of you." Roy Eskins looked at him. He said, "Son, I know exactly what happened here this morning. I am a former chief of police. That man behind you is a retired law enforcement sergeant with 22 years on the job. The man to my right retired as a colonel in the United States Army. The man to my left is a federal public defender with 30 years on the bench. And every one of us has a scheduled appointment in this facility this morning." He said, "I strongly suggest you call your supervisor. And then I suggest you step back and think very carefully about what kind of morning you want to have." Pruitt said, he was disruptive. Okafor said, "I know what he was. I have known him since 1969. He was not disruptive. He was a patient in a waiting room." He said it with the particular quietness of a man who has commanded rooms that contained real danger, and does not raise his voice for situations that do not require it. The lobby had acquired witnesses. Patricia at the front desk had not moved. 3 other patients in the waiting area visible from the lobby had not moved. A young staff member pushing a supply cart had stopped in the corridor. A physician in a white coat, mid-40s, with a badge that identified her as the morning's supervising clinician, had come to the edge of the waiting room when she heard the radio calls and had been watching for the last 4 minutes. Pruitt's radio crackled. His supervisor's voice came through it asking for a status update. Pruitt opened his mouth. He closed it. He pressed the radio and said, "Situation," as he stopped. "I need you down here." What followed was administrative rather than dramatic, but no less consequential for that. The facility administrator, a woman named Carol Ingram, arrived within 8 minutes. She took one look at the situation, 4 veterans of a combined age of approximately 250 years, standing in the lobby of a federal medical facility, while a contracted security officer stood beside them with a radio in his hand. And her face did something that faces do when they understand with complete clarity that a serious institutional error has been made. She said, "Mr. Thibodeau, I am deeply sorry. Please come with me." She did not say it to Pruitt. She did not ask Pruitt anything in that moment. She said it to Marcus. He looked at her. He said thank you. He followed her. Behind him, Roy Eskins looked at Pruitt one final time. He said, "You know what the difference is between authority and power." Pruitt said nothing. Eskins said, "Authority is something you earn. Power is something you think you have until you meet somebody who actually has it." He walked past Pruitt and into the waiting room. Darlene Reeves was still there. She had not gone anywhere. Her phone was in her hands, and she looked at Eskins, and then at Okafor, and then at Beaumont, and she said, "I got all of it." Eskins said, "Good." She sent the video to 4 people within the next 10 minutes. Her daughter, A, VA patient advocate. She had the number for a journalist at the regional paper who had written about VA conditions before, and a former colleague who worked in the office of the state's senior senator. The video was 44 minutes long. The relevant portion lasted 9 minutes. Pruitt's face was visible throughout. Marcus's appointment was rescheduled for that afternoon. The supervising clinician personally managed his intake. The facility administrator sat with him for 20 minutes before the appointment and asked him to describe what had happened, making notes in a manner that indicated she was taking a formal statement. Marcus gave the account the way he gave all accounts. He did not embellish. He did not editorialize. He said what happened in the sequence. It happened with the specific details that allowed another person to understand exactly what had occurred. Carol Ingram said, "I want you to know that this does not reflect the policy or the values of this facility." Marcus said, "I know that. I also know that policy and values are not the same as practice, and that practice is what happened in your waiting room this morning." She said you are right. He said I know. Carol Ingram spent 40 minutes with Marcus Eskins Okafor and Beaumont in her office before their appointments. What was said in that room was not recorded, but what came out of it was. Carol Ingram wrote a 3-page internal incident report that afternoon. She cited the video footage from the facility's own security cameras, which had captured the entire exchange. She cited the accounts of Patricia at the front desk and 3 other staff members who had observed the confrontation. She cited the 5 witness statements she collected from patients in the waiting room, including Darlene Reeves, who had stayed specifically because she intended to give one. The internal report documented, among other things, that Pruitt's request for identification had been made on no documented basis. That his request for Marcus to step outside had been made on no documented regulatory basis. That his radio call describing a disruptive individual was not supported by any recorded behavior on the part of the individual in question. And that his determination to physically contact a patient and remove him from the premises had been executed in violation of the facility's own patient rights protocols. She sent the report to the regional VA director at 4:17 that afternoon. She copied the Inspector General's office. The formal complaint Marcus filed with the Veterans Affairs Inspector General that afternoon was 7 pages long. He had written it in longhand, first a habit from his detective years, and then typed it at his kitchen table, his reading glasses on the small notebook open beside him for reference. The complaint cited specific regulatory violations, specific timeline discrepancies between Pruitt's account and the documented record, and the testimony of 5 witnesses, including a former chief of police, a retired colonel, and a federal public defender. The Inspector General's office acknowledged receipt within 48 hours. They opened a formal investigation within 72 hours. This was faster than average. This was not a coincidence. The regional journalist who received Darlene Reeves's video published a piece 4 days after the incident. It ran with the headline, "Veterans Affairs Security Guard Removes Decorated Veteran from Waiting Room." It included 3 paragraphs of Pruitt's supervisory record, which documented 2 prior complaints from other veteran patients, both of which had been resolved internally without discipline. The piece ran on a Thursday. By the following Monday, 2 members of the state's congressional delegation had issued statements. The VA regional director issued a statement of her own. The statement included the phrase, "We are reviewing our contracted security arrangements at all affected facilities." Pruitt's contract was terminated 16 days after the incident, effective immediately, with a notation in his employment record that he was ineligible for rehire in any VA contracted security role. James Beaumont had filed his own addendum to the Inspector General complaint. It was 2 pages long, and it did something Marcus's complaint had not done. It cited specific federal statutes governing patient rights in federal medical facilities, cross-referenced Pruitt's 3 prior complaints against the behavioral pattern they collectively documented, and requested a review of the contractor's company-wide hiring and supervision practices. Beaumont had drafted it in 3 hours at the kitchen table of the Beaumont VFW post, typing on his phone because he had not brought his laptop to what was supposed to be a quarterly meeting. Gerald Okafor had given a statement to the regional journalist who contacted him 2 days after the video went up. His statement was 4 sentences long. It said, "I have known Marcus Thibodeau since 1969. He served his country with distinction. He has served his community with distinction. What occurred in that waiting room is the precise opposite of what this country owes men like him." Okafor had declined to add anything further. He did not need to. The 4 sentences were sufficient. Roy Eskins had done something that none of them had expected. He had called the director of the private security company that held the VA contract. He had spoken to him for 22 minutes. He had not recorded the call. He had not needed to. He had simply explained in the tone of a man who had spent 16 years having conversations with people who needed to understand the full weight of what they were responsible for, exactly what the video showed, and exactly what would happen if the company's internal review did not produce a thorough and documented response. The director had listened. He had said very little. He had understood. It was not Marcus thought sufficient. It was not nothing. He thought about those two things simultaneously, as he had thought about many things simultaneously for 43 years. The gap between what was sufficient and what was possible, and the value of moving through that gap with your posture straight and your documentation accurate. Gerald Okafor called him the evening the termination was confirmed. He said, "How are you?" Marcus said, "I'm fine." Okafor said, "You handled that the way you handle everything." Marcus said, "How's that?" Okafor said, without giving them anything they could use. Marcus said, "That's the job." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 43 years ago, you told me something. You told me the way you handle the next 5 minutes is the only thing you ever actually control. You said if you get those right, the 5 minutes after that take care of themselves." Marcus said, "I was 20 years old. I don't remember saying that." Okafor said, "I do. I've been saying it to people ever since." Marcus sat with that for a long moment. Outside his window, the evening was settling over Beaumont, the particular quality of light that comes at the end of a day that has asked more of you than it had any right to. He thought about the VA facility. He thought about the hallway and the antiseptic smell and the chair he had been sitting in for 11 years and the chair he intended to sit in again on the second Thursday of next month. He thought about Darlene Reeves and her phone and the 44 minutes she had recorded. He thought about what Roy Eskins had said to Pruitt, the difference between authority and power. He had known that difference longer than Pruitt had been alive. He had learned it in 1969, in a country that did not belong to him, in a war that nobody won, with men who had taught him that the only authority that matters is the kind that holds when everything else is removed. He had carried it for 43 years. He was going to carry it for as long as he had left. Darlene Reeves called him 3 days after the incident. He did not know how she had gotten his number. He suspected Damien, but he answered and she said, "I want you to know that I have given a statement to every person who has asked me for one." She said I was in that room because I had an appointment same as you. I recorded because it was the right thing to do. She said my father was a veteran. Korea. He never talked about what it cost him, but I watched what it cost him. I know what you were doing in that waiting room. You were just trying to take care of yourself. That is not nothing. That should not be hard. He said, "Thank you, Ms. Reeves." She said, "Darlene." He said, "Thank you, Darlene." There was a pause. Then she said, "Are you going back?" He said, "Second Thursday of next month." She said, "Good, so am I." He thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. He thought about what it meant that she had stayed and recorded and given statements and then called him to confirm she was going back. He thought about the 44 minutes of footage on her phone and the chain of events that had followed the journalist, the congressional statements, the regional director's review, the termination of Pruitt's contract, and he thought about the fact that none of it had required anyone to do anything extraordinary. It had required people to do ordinary things correctly, to stay in a room when they could have left to hold a phone at the right angle to write things down, to pick up the phone and call. He had spent 22 years as a detective teaching younger officers that the resolution of most cases did not come from breakthroughs. It came from the accumulation of small, correct actions performed consistently by people who understood their responsibility to them. You document, you file, you follow up. You do not let the file close until it has been closed correctly. He had also taught them something else, which he had not learned in the department, but had carried in from before the department, from the time before the department, when he had been 20 years old in a country that was not his, and the only reliable resource was the people beside him. He had taught them when you are in a situation that is wrong, and you cannot immediately make it right. The most important thing you can do is ensure that what happened is accurately recorded, not because the record guarantees justice. It does not, but because the record is the only thing that can. An unrecorded wrong can be denied. A recorded wrong still might be denied, but it has to work harder to be, and the working harder is itself a form of accountability, incomplete but real. Darlene Reeves had understood this instinctively. She had not been trained to understand it. She had been a postal supervisor, and before that, a Navy veteran, and before that, a daughter watching a father who never talked about what the war had cost him. She had picked up the phone because the thing in front of her was wrong, and she had the capacity to document it, and she had used that capacity without waiting to be asked. He wanted to tell her that it mattered. He had when she called. He wanted to tell her it more precisely than he had managed, but he had not found the precise words, and he thought that was all right. She already knew. The kind of person who stays and records and then calls 3 days later to confirm she is going back, that kind of person already knows. The case cleared because somebody stayed in the room. The case always cleared because somebody stayed in the room. Marcus's son, Damien, drove up from Houston the weekend after the incident. He stayed 2 nights. On the first evening, they sat at the kitchen table, the way they had always sat at the kitchen table across from each other, with a meal between them, talking in the practical tones of 2 men who had learned to discuss difficult things by discussing them practically, without letting the difficulty become the subject. Damien said, "I watched the video." Marcus said, "I know." Damien said, "You didn't tell me how long it was." Marcus said, 44 minutes. Damien said, 9 minutes of that is you. The rest is Darlene Reeves recording an empty room. Marcus said she stayed. Damien said she stayed. They were quiet for a moment. Damien said, "I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it without correcting it." Marcus said, "Go ahead." Damien said, "I know you handled this the right way. I know that. I also know it cost you something, and you are not going to tell me what it cost you, and I am not going to make you. But I want you to know that I know. And I want you to know that every time you walk back in there every second Thursday, it is not nothing. It is the opposite of nothing. I am watching you do it. I have been watching you do it my whole life." Marcus said nothing for a moment. He said, "Your grandfather used to say something. He said the most dangerous man in any room is the one who knows his rights and has learned not to be angry about needing to use them. I never fully understood that until I was about 40. Damien said, "I understand it now." Marcus said, "I know you do." They finished the meal. They did the dishes. They sat with the evening the way they had sat with evenings all of Damien's life in a house that had always been orderly and principled and specific about what it expected from the people inside it. Outside, the April evening was settling into night, and somewhere across the city, the VA facility was dark and quiet, and the waiting room chairs were empty. And in 11 days, Marcus Thibodeau would drive to the second level of the parking garage and park in the same spot and walk through the same entrance, and Patricia would look up from her desk and say, "Mr. Thibodeau, right on time." And he would say, "Yes, ma'am." And all of it, the 43 years and the complaint and the notebook and the 7 pages and the video and the 4 men standing in a lobby and the difference between authority and power, all of it would be present in that exchange, invisible, accumulated, requiring no further comment. He would sit in the chair. He would open his book. He would read 3 pages without absorbing them the way he always did in waiting rooms, because the real purpose of the book was never the reading. The real purpose was having something to look at that was not the room, while the room arranged itself around him, and the appointment time approached, and the building did what buildings are supposed to do, which is hold the people inside it without requiring them to justify being there. He had earned the chair 11 years ago, and every second Thursday since. No one was going to change that. Not now. Not on any second Thursday still to come, not ever. The difference between authority and power is the difference between what you are given and what you have built. One can be taken. One cannot. Marcus Thibodeau had been building the thing that cannot be taken for 62 years. He intended to continue. He always had. He always would. That was the whole of it. The VA conducted a review of contracted security practices at all 12 facilities in the regional network. The review took 6 weeks. It produced a 31-page report. The report identified procedural gaps in supervision complaint review and behavioral pattern identification that were consistent across multiple facilities. It recommended specific changes to the hiring criteria for contracted security personnel, the mandatory reporting chain for patient complaints, and the documentation standards for any patient removal from facility premises. The report did not use Pruitt's name. It did not need to. His situation was the case that had produced the report, and the report was what mattered not to him, but to the veterans who would come after him, who would sit in the same chairs and produce their documentation and be confirmed by the same front desk staff and wait in the specific stillness of people who have learned to wait. They deserved to wait without what Marcus had faced. The report made it slightly more likely that they would. Marcus read the report when James Beaumont sent him a copy. He sat at his kitchen table with his reading glasses and a cup of coffee. Beverly across the table with her own work spread before her. And he read 31 pages of procedural findings in the specific careful way he had read case files for 22 years, looking for the places where the language was imprecise, where the recommendation was softer than the finding warranted, where the bureaucratic impulse to soften conclusions had operated on a conclusion that deserved to be harder. He found several such places. He called Beaumont. He named them. Beaumont said, "I know. I saw them." Marcus said, "Are they fixable?" Beaumont said through the comment period, "Yes. The review board will take formal responses to the draft report. I'm going to file one. You should too." "You." Marcus said, "Write mine." Beaumont said, "I was going to ask." He filed the comment. It was 4 pages. It addressed 3 specific recommendations in the report that he and Beaumont believed had been softened beyond what the evidence supported, and it cited with specific page and line references the evidence that supported a stronger formulation. The comment was entered into the administrative record. 2 of the 3 recommendations were strengthened in the final report. The third was not. But it was in the record, which meant the next review that touched these questions would find it. He had carried it for 43 years. He was going to carry it for as long as he had left. The second Thursday of next month he would be in that parking garage at the same time, in the same spot, walking the same route through the same entrance. He would sign in with Patricia. She would say, "Mr. Thibodeau, right on time." He would say, "Yes, ma'am." And the ritual would continue, because that is what you do with the things that are yours. You continue them, the second Thursday of every month, without exception, without fail. Subscribe our channel. We tell the stories of the people who do not put down what belongs to them.